I'm Tim Monroe, and this is what I really want to talk about. There's something fascinating about every single one of us. Everybody has a passion and a story to tell, something that lights them up. Every week I sit down with interesting people and we talk about the things that really matter to them and to all of us. It might be funny, it might be weighty, it might be weird, but it will always be captivating. It's not an interview, it's not the news, it's what I really want to talk about. Our guest today is Aaron Beale. He's the Associate Vice President at Berea College Student Craft. Aaron's work focuses on the amplification of the work of staff and student craftspeople here at Berea College. Trained as a chairmaker by Appalachian chairmaker Brian Boggs, he earned a bachelor's degree in history from Wayne State University with a focus on labor history and the lives of working people. This lifelong commitment to celebrating the historically excluded forms the foundation of his vision for Berea's student craft program. Welcome, Aaron. And what do you really want to talk about today?
Thanks, Tim. I would say I'm excited to talk about watches today. Watches, watchmaking, how they work, and why people like me think they're cool.
Okay, so you're this craftsperson. So before we get really into the watches, maybe give me just a really quick sort of summary of your journey to becoming a craftsperson, specifically a furniture maker.
Yeah, thanks. I got started in this. I guess my first job as a woodworker was a job that I just got because it was the only job that was available to me. I moved to Ireland in the late 1990s and was lucky enough to get my first job there was in a grocery store, which I actually loved working in the grocery store. But my second job, which is a daytime job, was at a woodworking, a joinery, as they would refer to it, that made wooden school furniture, wooden coffins, that sort of thing. And I found that I loved it. I loved everything about it. I loved the community in the shop. I loved having my hands on something. I loved having some level of control over what was completed by the end of the day. And through that, I started to read and study more about woodworking, and I learned about the woodworking tradition here in Berea, Kentucky, and moved here with the hopes of getting a job with a particular chairmaker, as you mentioned, Brian Boggs. Yep. That took me a while. I had to be fairly committed to that process and convince him that I was worth taking a chance on, and it worked out for me.
And here you are in this incredible job. I mean, amazing that you're able to take that skill, that passion that you have, and make a living doing it. So why watches? What is it about watches? What fascinates you about watches? And maybe if you can remember, sort of the first time you really realized this was a cool thing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think watches are tied up with my love of craft. I think the same thing is true about a watch as is true about a handmade chair or a table or a woven good. These are things that are made to last longer than most of the things we interact with today. And that's not just from a quality standpoint, but it's from the standpoint of the investment that was made in it by the person who makes it and the value that it can continue to have for people for multiple generations.
So what is that value, though? So on the one hand, a watch is a function. It's a piece of technology that measures time, right? We can look at it in lots of other ways too, and we can talk more about that as we go. But what is it about that? So it's if it feels like you're talking about watches that are not just a watch that's fairly simple. Maybe you buy at the drugstore that tells time. What kind of watches are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I am talking about things, and they don't have to be expensive items. They can be incredibly expensive items, but I'm attracted to things that are going to last for multiple generations, or at least have that potential. The absolute best and most accurate way for you or me or anyone else to know, anyone who's privileged enough to have a smartphone, is to look at the smartphone and see exactly what time it is, right? It's more accurate than the most expensive mechanical watch you can buy. It's very reliable as long as you can keep it charged, but it is a disposable object. Many of us have gone through multiple smartphones or multiple mobile phones over the years, and the watch sort of signifies to me something different, something that can last, again, for multiple generations. My sort of introduction and fascination with watches, I think, started with my father's watch. So my mother decided to buy a watch for my dad prior to the birth of my older brother as a commemoration of that birth. And so this was 1963.
Okay.
It's a great and I think interesting story. You know, at that point in time, my mom bought that watch on layaway and paid for it over the months leading up to my brother's birth. She was not allowed to have a layaway account as a woman in Detroit, Michigan in 1963. So she had to get someone from my dad's work to come and sign that paper and say that he would sort of vouch for her or financially back this.
Yeah.
I don't know what the details were.
Wow.
But she paid over time, and then my dad has had that watch and still wears that watch today. So
What kind of watch is it?
it's a Meyer. It's a Meyer Lifetime is what's stamped on there. I think that it's probably a watch that was made by, at this point, an anonymous watchmaker or watchmaking company. Not an individual watchmaker, I'm quite sure, but a watchmaking company, and then probably sold to a variety of jewelers who put their own name stamp on the dial.
Mm-hmm. And so this is the first watch that you, as a kid, saw and said, "Wow, that's a cool thing." Was it the thing itself, the object itself, that fascinated you, or was it more this story, or was it the sort of combination?
Yeah, I don't think it was. I know. I'm reasonably confident in the early days it wasn't the story at all. I probably didn't know the story.
Right.
But what I remember is when my dad was home from work, that watch would come off his wrist.
Mm-hmm.
His little silver pocket knife would come out of his pocket, and it would sit there on the counter in the kitchen.
Okay.
And it was sort of a signifier of my dad's presence at home, that he was there. The watch, I think I only loved that watch as a child because it was like looking at my father.
Yeah. Did he have other watches? Was that his only watch? Did he? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I actually just saw, just in the last 6 months or so, my dad dug out a Recta Recta wristwatch that he bought when he was 15, when he had completed the first stage of his apprenticeship.
Mm-hmm.
He and some friends went on a cycling trip from England to France. My parents grew up in England, and he bought this little square Recta watch at 15. He dug it out. I wound it up. It still runs today.
Still works, yeah.
And so that was his watch until he went into the Army. He bought another watch that he no longer has for his Army service because he didn't want to destroy this watch he had gotten prior to that. And then he wore that Recta until my mom gave him his Meyer, which is what he has today.
So, there's so many ways to think about watches and so many lenses through which to think about them or talk about them or understand them. One is it's a tool that tells time, right? And nowadays, especially, like you were mentioning, your smartphone or your smart watch that so many people have that tells time, keeps your heart rate, like all that stuff. But it doesn't feel like you're talking about that kind of watch. So what is it about, like what are the kinds of watches you're most interested in?
Yeah, I think watches that run mechanically. So I do have 2 quartz watches. I've got 4 watches that I own. 2 of them run on batteries, one on solar power, one on a battery. And I do like all of them for different reasons. But I think it is the mechanical aspect. I can't understand how a digital watch or a smartwatch works. Like that's beyond the way my brain works to kind of really understand everything that's happening in there. Mm-hmm. To me, it's like this piece of magic. Mm-hmm. A mechanical watch, I can almost understand. Yeah. And I think that's what I like about it the most is one, I still can't understand it.
Right.
And I, would never be able to be I don't have that depth of understanding, but I can follow the way the springs work and the gears work, and I can almost get there.
Yeah.
And I think it's that the watches that fascinate me are those watches that have that component, right? I can almost, it's really simple things, right? It's a wound up spring, just like a toy you would give a child, right? Mm-hmm. You wind up a spring, turn a little crank, wind a spring, it bunny hops across the floor.
Right.
That's the same spring as is in a watch. But then its release of power and the way it translates that power into the moving of the hands is very sophisticated.
Right.
And so that's the piece that fascinates me the most, I think.
And I think, you were saying how the, like a digital watch or a smartphone or whatever is magic to you, and you can't fathom how that works. But to me, that mechanical device, I can sort of understand on a like it's a spring and then unwinds and it makes the hands go around. But I could never. The thing I always struggle is, how does someone actually make that?
Yeah.
Like, that's the part that that I have a hard time with. So, but let's back up a little bit here. So you say you own 4 watches, which isn't that many. Like, I know there's like collectors who might own hundreds of watches,
Sure.
right? So, are there any other ways that this interest manifests itself in your life besides having 4 watches?
Yeah, totally. And in fact, I would say that having 4 watches is like the smallest part of
Right.
it. You know, it is the fact that I guess the most enjoyable thing or activity that I can sort of think about in my life is trying to understand something that I don't quite understand. And again, that's not very stimulating to me if I can't understand it at all, like the smartphone or like a digital watch, right? It's so far removed from my understanding that there's really no pleasure to it. But something that runs on springs and gears, I can keep trying to understand that. So, you know, whether it's reading a book about how this works, whether it's reading a book about someone's opinion about how it works or what the best way to do it is, all of this stuff is what I find fascinating about how watches.
So you read, yeah.
Yeah, I read. I watch, like everyone today, I watch YouTube videos, of which there's an unlimited amount.
Yeah,
Of either people who are making watches and telling their story, or people who have watches in their lives and are telling those stories.
Right. So do you think of watches as, in your own life, like the 4 watches you own, why those particular watches? And maybe pick one, maybe your favorite, and talk about why you like that watch, what it is about that watch that is meaningful to you.
Sure. Yeah. So the watch I'm wearing today as we sit here is a Seiko Alpinist.
Okay.
So this watch is not particularly old, but this watch was designed in 1959 or put to market in 1959. And it was the first Seiko watch that was designed for an audience inside Japan. Prior to that point, Seiko was trying to imitate Swiss watchmaking.
Okay.
And produce not replicas, that wouldn't be fair to Seiko, but they were trying to build on an identity of what a watch should look like that was already established. This watch was designed as a sports watch. It was Seiko's first sports watch, so not a dress watch, designed to be put into rugged conditions for mountaineers in Japan. And so this watch is important to me because it does stand for a step in a certain style of design that has been carried on now from 1959 to the present.
Okay, so there's a continuum, a tradition of that type of watch that you're interested in.
Yeah, or that sort of design inspiration. So the watch, just to describe it for folks that I have, it's got sort of large markers at the 12, 3, 6, and 9, which are representative of north, south, east, and west. So it kind of builds off the language of the cardinal directions, thinking of the needs of a mountaineer and what they would have, representative of mountain peaks in the style, sort of large triangle markers at those positions. And that's something with the Seiko company that they've really stayed true to, especially with Grand Seiko, which is a different division of Seiko at this point, making their more higher-end pieces, that are really, really building on that long, long Japanese tradition of tying artistic expression to nature and drawing inspiration from nature.
So you hear a lot about Swiss watches, right? I guess that's the gold standard, maybe. At least that's sort of the reputation. So what is it about? Do you own a Swiss watch?
I don't.
You do not. Okay. So, but you must know all this tradition. So what is it about the Swiss watches that people value so much?
I mean, I think that I think the Swiss achieved a high level of success. I think that the way watches were traditionally made in Switzerland, I think where great watches come from has moved around. Like England was very much a watchmaking center. France was very much a watchmaking center. Switzerland is now, as you say, sort of the gold standard or the most common watchmaking country. When you think of a great, we say that car runs like a Swiss watch. These are sayings for a reason. I think the weather conditions, I think the rural lifestyle in Switzerland led to that. So traditionally, watches, you may have one very small maker in their home who's making hands for a watch. You might have another maker who's making certain components for the movement, someone else who's making a dial. And so people were able to work on these things, especially in the colder winter months, in a small studio in an isolated spot. And then they were all taken somewhere else to be assembled or purchased as a group. So I think that culture sort of led to watches booming in Switzerland.
Right.
And it has built through there throughout the years.
So do you think about as the 4 watches you own, or just watches in general? Like I was sort of referring to before, there's so many ways to think about a watch, so many lenses through which to view a watch. Are watches to you an item of fashion, an aesthetic thing that you like wearing on your body, or do you think of it differently?
Yeah, I think they are that for sure.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of, I guess what I sort of consider, and this goes back to the craft work that I do, to the furniture work that I do, and to watches, it's all the same. I think we've maybe bought into an idea of a separation of form and function, and I think that the aesthetic qualities, the way an object makes you feel, is a function, just like timekeeping is a function. So definitely the way they look, the way they fit on the wrist, that all plays a role. All of the watches that I have are sort of unique steps of design.
Okay.
Sort of an evolution of the design. Every watch I have is from Japan.
Okay.
There's a variety of reasons for that.
Right.
But they're all sort of key points in the progression of watchmaking in Japanese watchmaking history.
Right. So as a craftsperson yourself, do you think about watches and are curious, and because you talked about this before, like it's the kind of thing you're trying to understand, but you think you actually could understand, like how to make a watch or how a watch works, right? So do you take them apart? Do you like, is that something you're interested in doing and like sort of digging in there and seeing how it all works?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, to say take it apart, I haven't been that brave yet.
Yeah.
But I have opened my watches up. I've replaced the gaskets or the seals to make sure that they retain waterproofness. I've adjusted the timekeeping to make them hopefully more accurate at the end of the day, but often takes me many times. So, so that sort of very simple interaction with the mechanical workings of the watch, which is probably on par with like putting oil in your car.
Right.
Right. It's not watchmaking.
Right.
Just like but yeah, you can see in there. You can turn some screws. You can change the way it runs.
Yeah.
And I do find that really fascinating.
Right. And you used the word disposable before to talk about sort of a lot of today's technology, and I think that's true of a lot of things, not just watches, but like if you think about our relationship to all kinds of technology, where back I can sort of remember in the day in the little neighborhood where I grew up, there was a guy who would fix like toasters and vacuum cleaners and that kind of thing. Whereas today, if your vacuum cleaner doesn't work, you just go buy another one. And watch is the same thing. Like if it's just a basic functional thing, if it stops working, maybe you change the battery, but chances are you just go buy another one. So what's happened? Like why? Because I think the kind of watch you're talking about is the kind of watch that you want to maintain, you want to take care of, you want to keep over time for a long time. Like you mentioned your father's watch, which he probably still has, right?
He does, yeah.
And maybe someday you or your brother will inherit it and treasure it and want to keep it for a long time too.
Yeah, for sure.
So what's happened? Like what? And I mean, it relates to your other work too, creating things that last, things that are beautiful. But what's happened here that's kind of gone away?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a whole cultural thing, and I think it pervades every aspect of our lives. And I think that's where craft as a concept, which I think is the same with watchmaking as it is with chair making or ceramics or anything. It is about making something that is more permanent, or at least has the potential to be more permanent. I think that we want a lot of things in today's culture. It's not to over-romanticize the past, because I don't, nor do I claim to know all about it, but I think that people might own one really good suit for a long time, and they would take it and get it altered as they gained weight and got older, and make that last. That's just not how we think about things today, and I think a tremendous amount of goodness is lost by our desire for something immediately. So watches are expensive. Mechanical watches are expensive. You can buy a good mechanical watch for less than $500. You can spend $500,000, or more. So they really want to run a range. But even $500 is a serious purchase,
a lot of money, yeah.
right? And so it's not something that you just decide at lunch that you want and you run out to the store after work and you buy one. And I think it's important to have things in our life that are like that.
Yeah. So let's go back because I'm looking for a definition here. So when you say mechanical watch, right, you mean a watch that has no battery, that has no power other than its own workings. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So a mechanical watch would not have a battery watch. There's for simplicity's sake, let's say there's two basic camps of watches. You have mechanical watches, which work by somehow winding a spring, that tension of that spring is released slowly, and it's all regulated mechanically. Now, that could be a watch you wind the crown to put power into it, or it could be what's called an automatic watch, which has a rotor inside of it that spins as you walk or as your body moves, that winds it, but there's no battery.
Right.
And then you have what would be called a quartz watch, which has a little piece of quartz inside that oscillates by having electricity put into it from a battery.
Okay.
And that piece of quartz vibrates at a certain frequency, and that's what regulates the timekeeping.
So all your watches are mechanical watches, I'm assuming, or no?
They're not. So
They're not.
two are mechanical
Okay.
and two are
quartz. Okay. So the mechanical watches then, how often do you have to wind them?
So if you don't, I tend to wear a watch. I don't change my watches every day.
Yeah.
Some people do.
Yeah.
And so you might be able to keep multiples of them wound and running. I tend to put it on a watch and wear it for several weeks.
Yeah.
Unless, like the Alpinist that I'm wearing today, which is sort of tells a story about how we dress in today's culture. This was a sports watch then. This is my dress-up watch today,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
It's a change in how we do things. But once a watch is wound, it might run for 2 days or 3 days before that power goes away if you're not somehow putting other power into it, either by walking around and wearing it or by winding it.
Right. And when did quartz watches come into existence?
Quartz watches came into existence in the 1970s.
70s, okay.
And it really almost killed the mechanical watch industry.
Right.
I mean, a quartz watch, this is one of those funny things. There's a lot of things that don't make sense about watches or many other passions that we have. From an objective standpoint, a quartz watch is superior in pretty much every way.
In terms of keeping time.
In terms of keeping time,
Right.
in terms of durability or resistance to shock.
Okay.
If I drop this watch from a table onto a tile floor,
Right.
it may have to go on a visit to a professional to make
Yeah.
it work right again.
Okay.
If you drop a quartz watch onto a tile floor, it's probably going to be
Probably
fine.
okay, yeah.
It's much more robust, much more durable.
Yeah.
So it was a huge step forward, and they're also tremendously more affordable, easier to make. There's it's not a computer chip, but again, this gets into things I
Right.
don't understand. There's some sort of solid state component in there
Yeah.
that is sending power into this quartz oscillator.
Right.
It's vibrating.
I mean, the whole idea, and I want to get into this, talk more about, not to get too deep about any of this, but maybe talk more about the idea of time. But to me, how you make that spring work and not, for 2 days and all that stuff, and that it make the hands move at a particular rate, like that to me blows my mind. And I think you take it for granted, sort of, right? But it just feels like so impossible to make that happen. So do you think about that? Like, do you wonder, or do you kind of know, or are you trying to figure out how that works?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the most general sense, I know how that works,
Yeah.
and I do. I feel the exact same way that you do about
Yeah.
that. It is the fact that a human being figured out how to use a coiled up piece of metal and a bunch of springs, other springs, gears, to measure time really quite accurately, is an amazing accomplishment
Yeah.
and an amazing sort of testament to what humans can figure out. And the fact that humans are still figuring out ways to make that work better. And this is not like the watches that I own, and I'm sure the only watches that I will own throughout my lifetime are made in large factories
Right.
after someone figured this out, and they've. But there are individuals out there who are making 1 watch, 2 watch, 4 watches a year,
Right.
and they're doing it by hand, and they're painstakingly trying to make improvements in either the philosophy or the overall design of how the power from that spring is released and how it regulates time, or just improvements in the craftspersonship of how it's done.
Right. Let's talk about that for a minute, because that's sort of, I think, what fascinates me is this idea of a watch as a product of craft making, right? And you know this in your own work. You make beautiful furniture, and you work to help students create crafts. And I guess it's sort of, and you touched on this before, defined by sort of form meeting function, right? That the things you make are usable, they're functional, that you can sit on them, you can eat on them, you can, whatever, you can use them in some way in your daily life, but they're also beautiful. They also have an aesthetic value that people really appreciate. It's not like IKEA, right? I mean, some people might think IKEA furniture is beautiful, and it's fine. But I'm not dissing IKEA, but you know what I mean. But then, to me, the challenge is, and that becomes sort of very precious, right? So, someone who makes 1 or 2 watches, hand makes 1 or 2 watches a year, those watches probably are super expensive, right? So, how much would a watch from one of the premier watchmakers, if they make 2 or 3 watches a year, how much would that watch cost?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, that's not something that I really track all that well.
Yeah.
But I mean, $100,000 or more,
Right.
for a watch.
Yeah.
And you think about the raw materials that go into that, the fact that you may spend a year on it. It's an interesting thing, and something I guess I'm grateful for. Like, I can really enjoy a lot of watches that I will never afford, and in all likelihood probably never actually see in person,
Right.
or touch with my own
Maybe in a
hands.
museum or something. Yeah.
And it's not really about the ownership.
Right.
It's the fact that someone is doing this amazing thing. Someone is that committed to pursuing a goal, and pursuing excellence at something. That just really brings me a lot of joy.
Yeah.
Because I think so much of our world today, it's a rare thing, I think, for any of us to have the time and space to truly do our best work. Most of us are juggling multiple things, right? So we make a decision. How do I, whether it's writing an email to someone, something simple like that, whether it's crafting a chair or a table, how do I make the best thing I can in a defined amount of time, so they can either reach a certain price point, or I have to return 40 emails today, so I can only spend X number of minutes on each one.
Right.
I'm not going to craft the language. I'm not
Right.
going to. And we've come to accept that as normal. And I think the craft that goes into any truly crafted object stands as sort of a counterpoint to what we've accepted as sort of the normal. This is what life is.
Right.
Right. Life can be different than that, and it has been different than that. It continues to be different from that in some certain defined areas.
Yeah. So the discipline and the I'm trying to find the right word here. Just the sheer duration, time that it takes to make a handmade watch that functions perfectly is, in a sense, pushing back on this tide of I don't want to say modernity, because that's not the right word, but the world moving so quickly and so much coming at us all the time. But on the other hand, it makes those things, whether it be a crafted rocking chair or a beautiful handmade watch, sort of out of the reach in terms of price of almost everybody, right? And I just find that like an interesting conundrum, right? Because I value those things so much, and I value the people who have the time and the discipline and the passion to really focus and really make something like that that's both beautiful and functional. But on the other hand, there's just it it becomes then sort of this quaint, almost like a museum piece, right? And sort of where does that fit in our culture?
Yeah, I mean, and I do. I think all of that is right.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way. And
Yeah.
I think that a watch that's made by an individual maker, I would think of as exactly the same as a painting by Van Gogh.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It never crosses my mind to think about how much it costs, because that's not what it's about. It's not about owning this thing. It's about the fact that a human being was able to make this beautiful thing, beautiful from a technical standpoint, beautiful from an aesthetic standpoint. They figured out the engineering, they figured out how to make it come to life, and it exists.
Yeah.
And just the fact that it exists is enough to make my life feel a little richer, without any concern about ever having to touch it or own it or.
Right. And I would assume, well, just sort of maybe I'm romanticizing, but the people who do this, who make handmade all of the components and put them together and make a handmade watch, whether it's something to wear on your wrist or a pocket watch or something like that, that they didn't start it because they thought, I'm going to make a living doing this, right? It seems to me like a great artist like Van Gogh or whoever, they had this passion. They had almost like this compulsion to do this thing, or just wanted to know, can I do this? Is it possible to do this? And maybe their whole endeavor was completely separate from commerce, right? Perhaps eventually it became commercial because like, oh, some collector's going to want this and they'll pay me a lot of money for it, right? But that's not why they did it. Do you think that tends to be the case, or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the few stories that I've heard, this is not something that I know, nor do I know any of these.
Yeah.
I've never had a conversation with
Right.
someone who's making
A handmade watchmaker, yeah.
But I think perhaps a lot of them do start it as a career, but they may be thinking like, I'm going to be a watch repair person, right? And they don't. I wonder how many start off actually thinking, I'm going to make a watch,
Right.
or I'm going to lead a small workshop of 5 or 6 other people and do this.
Yeah.
I suspect that more often it is they've received technical training because they're going to do watch repair for a large commercial distributor of watches or a local shop in a town, in a large city now. They don't have them in towns, unfortunately, anymore. They're rare and rare all the time. But I think they probably start from many probably start from a practical standpoint of this is a way to make a living. And then they get bitten by a bug. Yeah. And, and it's, I guess in some ways, not at all putting myself on that same level, but like when I started woodworking, no one would look at those pieces that I was involved with being made when I was in Ireland or, and mostly there I was shuffling lumber around, and like cutting things to dimensions. Like no one would define that as a craft activity. But being in that environment and then studying more about what was possible led me to moving here and then pursuing a job with a true craftsperson and, aspiring to make pieces that would reach that standard of really being considered craft.
So let's talk a little bit more about the sort of cultural issues and the watch as so certainly watches, especially not handmade, but expensive, maybe mechanical watches have become symbols of status, right? You see, the ads you often see are in magazines, for instance, of a father handing my Patek Philippe is going to go to my son, and this very sort of wealthy environment, and that's become it's a real cultural touchstone that watches convey status, prestige, but not just that, because you can get that in other ways too. But I think there's also something having to do with more what you're talking about, that they also convey a sense of taste, for lack of a better word. And that's not quite the right word, but style, concern for aesthetics, that kind of thing. How did that happen? Like, has that always been the case? And maybe you don't know, but I just think it's an interesting concept.
Yeah. I mean, I think that watches, I suppose cars in a certain way, clothing, which I don't really know anything about. I'm sure there's clothing or maybe if I think about like really expensive handbags or something, again, something I don't know anything about. These are pieces of art that you can take out and show off, right? So you buy, if you love art and you're an art collector, or you're extremely wealthy, and you just want to buy a very expensive piece of art and hang it in your home, well, you can't really you can't show that off to everyone.
Right.
And I'm not at all saying that this showing off is a good thing, but you're right, it is a big part of the culture that surrounds any sort of luxury good,
Right.
which a watch is. And yeah, I mean, I think it's from my standpoint, that's an unfortunate reality of what's tied up in watches. I think there are a lot of people who, I mean, who am I to judge? And I'm not. Anyone can have. It's not for me to say why you have something and why it brings you joy and what role it plays. I think it's unfortunate if all that watch on your wrist means is a way to demonstrate power or show your wealth or show your success. Like I think again, I don't mean to be judgmental.
Yeah.
But perhaps you're missing another level of joy that exists in that object that you could understand.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, so many things like you're talking about convey status, but you can't necessarily wear them outside, wear them out of your house, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to carry your canvas around town as you walk around. But it is an interesting idea, and the whole sort of thinking of a watch as a transmission of history, because I do think that's another piece of it. Like you're talking about your father's watch, and you now know the story of how your mother purchased it. It's very specific details on layaway, and the way he would take it off and put it down, and then that you sort of had this very deep connection that watch sort of symbolized who your father was and maybe what he is. He's still around.
Yeah.
Who your father is and what he means to you, and a watch as a sort of a symbol of individuality, maybe a symbol of, and something you can convey to the next generation. And I wonder why watches are like that more than, say, a tie or a suit, or the kind of. I mean, I suppose a car would be that way, but I don't even think I don't think cars are even that way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is easier. It's an easier object to hold on to. It's an easy object to pass down. So my daughter now wears the watch that I was given in the late 1980s. And I wore that watch for multiple decades. Similar to my dad's watch, she remembers me wearing that watch when she was little, and now she wears it today. So it's easy to give that as a gift to her. Unlike the car I had in 1989, if that watch breaks down, she's not going to be stranded somewhere.
Right.
And but she can carry that with her, and she can sort of there are memories tied up in that watch, I think, for her that relate to me and her life as a child and seeing it there. So, I mean, I suppose there probably are other things, like maybe people have other types of, I mean, a watch is a piece of jewelry, so people may have other pieces of jewelry, necklaces, earrings, rings, that they pass down within their family. But I do think that their durability, if they're made with a certain level of quality, they're able to be repaired, as you were saying earlier, right? There's no one, I'm sure that's probably actually not true. I'm sure there are people who buy really expensive watches and then just get rid of them when they stop working.
Right.
But, a mechanical watch, at least, and some quartz watches are made to be repaired and taken care of for many generations. And there is sort of, you reference that sort of famous Patek Philippe tagline of, you don't own a Patek Philippe, you just
you
look
take
after
care of it for the next generation.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And, there's something that you can feel kind of critical about that because of the amount of money and wealth that's wrapped up in that. But there's also something I think that's kind of beautiful about that.
Yeah, I do too. And I wonder, I think it has something to do with the idea of time itself, right? That a watch is measuring time, and the generations measure time, and if you can sort of keep that thing, it's a way of, I don't want to say slowing time down, but remembering and thinking about this idea that time passes, but there are certain things that sustain. whether that be family ties, values, etc. And maybe in some ways a watch can be a symbol of that. Like you're talking about your dad's watch or the watch now your daughter wears that she remember you wearing, and maybe she doesn't just look at the watch to tell time, but she's also looking at it to say, well, I remember my dad when he was this, and later she's going to remember you different way.
Yeah.
And then someday you'll be gone and she'll probably still have the watch. I think that's, watches and clocks are very prominent in literature and movies and as a symbol of all kinds of things, right? And sometimes scary and sometimes not. But I think like the fascination with watch is both, and my text keeps beeping, which I can't make stop. But anyway, the watches are conveying this in hopefully a beautiful and pleasant way that you can wear on your body. And I think there aren't many other things like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you do. You wear it over time. You accumulate memories with it over time. Mm-hmm. I remember going to this event or having this experience at work and looking down and checking the time and having this watch on. Now, many years are gone past, and here I am looking down at that same sort of touchstone. Mm-hmm. And so, I think they can convey a very similar feeling, And I think I'm looking at my wrist and seeing my wedding band. Mm-hmm. It's a similar sort of thing. It's with you, and I think that is something else that's special about a watch or the type of art that you can carry with you every day.
Yeah.
Right? It might be more difficult to put memories in a painting that's hanging in your living room because you're having all these experiences outside of your living room.
Right.
But theoretically, at least, you can be having a whole wide variety of life experiences, and that watch is with you through that.
Yeah.
And I do think that adds additional value for sure.
Yeah. There's things that we want to maintain and keep and protect and give to the next generation and hand down to the next generation. And it seems for many people, this hasn't been true in my family, but for many people, watches are one of those things. And so I think it's not just a piece of jewelry or an accessory. It's a lot more than that to a lot of people, and feels like it is to you too.
Yeah, it is for sure.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate this. It's been a great conversation, and I hope someday we can maybe do it again sometime in the future, or maybe there's something else you really want to talk about at some other point.
Cool.
But so thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I appreciate it.
All right.